How's it going, everybody? I'm Jakejames Lugo, and welcome to the channel, where you'll find some of the most fair and honest game reviews out here. And finally, I'm playing a game that everybody and their mother has told me to sit down and play. Final Fantasy IX. This is something that everybody has told me is really good, but now that I finally played through it in full, let's talk about it. Imagine for a second that it's the arrival of the new millennium, and so much has already changed for the games industry. The PlayStation 1 was a massive success, but there's even bigger things to get excited about over the horizon with the coming of the PlayStation 2. But before JRPG fans dive into the next gen, the original PlayStation still has one final hurrah for them. Final Fantasy IX was released on the PlayStation 1 in November of 2000. It's the 9th game of the franchise, but it wasn't the final Final Fantasy game released for the console. A few more spin-offs and re-releases came out just before the end of the PlayStation's console lifespan. Final Fantasy IX gets a lot of praise for being the game that returned the series to its humble fantasy roots after the crazy success of Final Fantasy VII and the lukewarm reception of Final Fantasy VIII. Both of those games had a more futuristic vibe to their worlds and characters. But Final Fantasy IX goes back to the medieval times with castles, a connection to nature, and magic involving the crystals. We're introduced to the world of Gaia and a young orphan named Zidane. He's part of a group of thieves called Tantalus, and is hired for a job to kidnap Princess Garnet from the Kingdom of Alexandria. Unfortunately for him and his crew, the job goes very awry as Garnet doesn't resist capture and wants to get away from her mother, Queen Braun, who has gone mad and have done some horrible things behind the scenes. The Queen wants to expand her rule from Alexandria over the entire Mist continent, using powerful magic and nefarious means. Through Zidane and Garnet's adventure outside of Alexandria, we come to learn of Queen Braun's dark motivations, the conflict between the kingdoms within the Mist continent, and eventually the world of Gaia and its history. But like any other Final Fantasy game, there's so much more lurking beyond our first impression of this new world, including a mysterious man named Kuja lurking behind the scenes and even darker force at play. That being said though, does Final Fantasy IX come together into a phenomenal experience as the last big mainline entry for the original PlayStation? Or is it vastly overhyped? So the story of this game. Personally for me, I'm not a huge fan of what happens towards the very middle portion of the game and also the very end. There was just a couple things, a couple events in here and there that I just wasn't really a fan of. I just think that they could have been handled a little bit better and could have been given a little bit more oomph for what was going on in the story. That being said, however, I will admit that one of my favorite aspects of Final Fantasy IX's plot is the relationship between Garnet and Zidane. I felt that their love story, or just their growing love over the course of their tale and their quests, it just was handled very well. It kind of reminds me a little bit of what was going on with Final Fantasy VIII and Squall and Rinoa. However, this one has just got a better pace. It's just the little moments between them from the very beginning all the way throughout towards the end. You get to see these little moments where they get to spend time together, and I thought that was really well done. It just was cute seeing them just again, grow together with their love, and just little things in there and there that just were super cute. It was just awesome to see that just handled in such a great way, especially for a story that isn't solely about romance and love. Like, there's all these other things going on with it, but it did have that element that was just very well done. The other thing that I think was really well done, that's probably my favorite aspect of the entire story, is Vivi and his backstory. Just what's going on with the Black Mages and Gaia, and how they come into play with all the stuff going on with the kingdoms, and just Vivi's place in this world. I like this. I think that it was really freaking cool. Vivi just looks cute. It looks awesome to me, and again, he's a Black Mage, which, you know, harkens back to the original Final Fantasy, and just all these other things that just work together so well. He's my favorite character. He's got the funniest personality in my personal opinion, and I just love everything that's going on with him. However, on the flip side of all this, I will say that I don't like Kuja as a villain. I'm sorry, Final Fantasy IX fans. I'm sorry, Final Fantasy fans who are more general out there. I just don't like Kuja. I think that it was interesting, his build-up, and he was teased like early on in the game. I'm like, okay, like I'm starting to get with this. You know, I'm into what's going on with Queen Braun and like how he might be influencing stuff. But when things finally get answered and things finally get revealed, I just felt it was kind of underwhelming. I thought it was a little bit disappointing. And then once you start going to the other planet stuff and you start to really get into what's going on with Zidane, Kuja, and what's happening with Gaia, I just was like, you know what? This does what most Final Fantasy games do, which is fine, but it just kind of like, it was just kind of bleh. It was just kind of like whatever. It wasn't super exciting or as epic as I wish it was. Now, before we move on to gameplay, there's a couple other things I do want to touch on, which I think are very important for a Final Fantasy game, i.e. being the visuals, but more importantly, the music. Funny enough, I actually feel very indifferent about the soundtrack to Final Fantasy IX. There's a few standout tracks to me, such as the main battle theme, Vamos a la Flamenco when you're at the theater, and some of the boss fight music. But the rest of the soundtrack I really didn't care for. None of it is bad music by any stretch. The OST was done by Nobuo Uematsu after all, but the majority of the music didn't impact me all that much, unlike other Final Fantasy games I've played where the soundtrack really stuck with me long after I finished the game. So because I'm playing the remaster of Final Fantasy IX on the PlayStation Network, which you can get on PS3, PS4, and PS5, as well as a bunch of other platforms, I will say that granted, this is a much older game. Again, it's from the PlayStation 1 era. It's cool to see the HD version, or at least of the models for characters like Zidane, Garnet, Vivi, etc. However, it is still a shame, much like Final Fantasy VIII Remastered, that the environments didn't really get a whole lot of love. They still look very polygonal. They look very kind of like, you know, low poly, low texture. I wish that, especially with the overworlds, that a little bit more attention, or at least, you know, a little bit more cleanup went into those areas of the game. It just would have worked well besides having the really high res, or at least quote unquote high res models of these characters running around in much better environments. Because as is, they're just copy and paste from the PlayStation 1, or at least that's what I think. I don't think they did any sort of work with the environments or the areas that you explore. That's a little bit disappointing because it would have been nice to see everything kind of match up very well together. Alright, now that we got all that out the way, let's talk about the important stuff with Final Fantasy IX. Especially if you played Final Fantasy 7 or 8, you're really kind of intrigued by what was going on with the gameplay of Final Fantasy IX. Because there is a lot of stuff here to really touch on that is, again, super interesting. The one big thing that I can say about Final Fantasy IX's gameplay is that Square Enix did a real about-face with a lot of the things they tried in previous games. The important parts for this JRPG series are still here, such as running around a large world, random battles, and earning experience to level up your characters, but the way that magic is handled goes back to a more traditional Final Fantasy approach. This was definitely a big plus for many people who disliked the way magic was done in Final Fantasy VIII, and looking back at it now all these years later, I really feel like it was the right call. However, the game does have a few of its own nuanced characteristics that spice things up a little bit for the better. For example, characters can now enter a state called trance, which boosts the overall strength of them in combat. This happens after they take enough damage from enemies and fill up the trance meter. Their appearance changes when they go into trance, and they get all powered up for a brief time. Some characters also gain new abilities and new commands when this happens, but the game never really goes further with it as much as it probably should. I wish every character had more trance-exclusive abilities that made them super interesting. I honestly have no idea why Square didn't do so. It just feels like a missed opportunity here that could have been really interesting. Another side to leveling up your party that I really enjoyed was how you gain abilities through the use of equipment. You gain AP from winning battles, which allows you to level up the proficiency of active and passive abilities that are tied to equipment. You could attain those abilities permanently if you gain enough AP to bring them up to max. I actually really like this because it lets you branch out to using different kinds of equipment for every character, since not every ability and every piece of equipment is geared towards every character. Some of them will cater one thing towards a specific character, but then offer something completely different towards another. Because of this, you have to do a little bit of micromanagement, but as you get deeper into the game and find more spots to create new weapons and new items, things get very interesting. Now about the party that you have in this game. Per usual, I found myself gravitating towards a specific group most of the time. It does take a while before you get to that point where you could swap out party members, but I like how diverse the roster can be. Of course, you'll always have Zidane with you, so that's a given. Characters like Vivi and Freya are great for most situations for their great use of magic and skill attacks. Steiner and Armorant are your physical powerhouses that deal great damage, while Garnet and Eiko are your white mage extraordinaires with healing magic and summons. The one character I will say that I felt very indifferent about was Quina, mostly because blue magic abilities are such a weird thing to work with. You have to get Quina to eat certain enemies in order to learn new attacks, but not every enemy has something to offer and you can only do so when they're weak enough to consume. It's like it's a lot more trouble to get all of these abilities with Quina rather than actually using them against enemies. Don't get me wrong, Quina has some amazing stuff that's devastatingly powerful and super useful in certain battles, but it was just annoying getting what I needed. I will say though it's a damn shame that some of the other characters you come across are very underutilized, such as Beatrix. She's a boss fight and eventually becomes an ally for certain points of the game, but it would have been nice to see her also be part of some of the events that the party deals with towards the very end. I know that's a nitpick for sure, but it's just how I felt by the time I finished the main story. So if there's just one little thing I could be a little nitpicky about with FF9's gameplay, it would be the boss fights. Now, that being said, I used a guide during most of the time when I was playing this game, which there's nothing wrong with using a guide. Again, it could actually help you get through certain sections of most games. But the thing about this is that I feel like it's almost necessary with Final Fantasy IX because definitely you're going to need a lot of preparation for certain boss fights. And without it, I feel like my game time would have been massively extended. It just would have been really annoying and tedious to find out which combinations of certain spells and stuff that I needed beforehand before actually going into a certain boss fight. It happened to me a few times where I tried to deviate from not using the guide and then all of a sudden I hit a brick wall and I'm like, okay, what am I doing wrong here? And it was because I actually didn't have certain spells or certain equipment or just set myself up beforehand before actually engaging with a boss fight. It's not too bad, and again, once you have a guide, you're good, but some of these boss fights, it feels like, you know, I would have never figured that out had I not had the guide to assist me. The only other difference with this is at the very end of the game, which is a boss gauntlet between a couple boss fights you have to deal with right before the finale. And to me, you guys know this if you've been watching my reviews for a long time, I can't stand boss gauntlets for any reason, especially towards the finale of a game. To me, that is just very cheap. It feels like padding, it's annoying, and if you mess up in one section, you gotta deal with all this other stuff afterwards. And when you're at the very end of the game, the one boss fight, which is against, like, you know, the incarnation of death pretty much, it's just such a cheap fight. Again, preparation is everything, and if you don't go in with a couple different things to really aid you and help you out in order to get your stable ground during this boss fight, you're going to get steamrolled for no reason, and you're going to have to deal with all the other fights all over again. Now, in all fairness to the game, there is an option at the main menu where you could actually choose to continue right from a checkpoint right before a boss fight that you might have lost at, but most of the time, it just puts you right at the same point, at the same status that you were when you got there, and to me, that's a little bit annoying. I would have rather had it where it actually fully healed you, or at least did something to aid you in that way. But again, wishful thinking, you have to end up, most of the time at least I had to end up loading up my previous save right before all that stuff. And it happened to me, I want to say about 2 or 3 times trying to get through these boss fights, and it's just, again, I just can't stand boss gauntlets. Again, I feel they're cheap, they're just not needed. At least give me a save sphere or some like save point that I can actually prepare beforehand so I don't have to do all this all over again if I screw up in 1 or 2 sections. Now keep in mind, that's all just the main gameplay stuff, especially if you're just going through the main story. But what about all the other extra content? Because Final Fantasy games are known for all of their side quests and optional boss fights and optional stuff that you can engage with in order to kind of like really open yourself up to the world around you. So how does FF9 really handle this? I'll be honest with all of you. I didn't finish and complete every side quest that's within Final Fantasy IX. It's just annoying that certain things are completely missable. If you just don't know about something beforehand and don't look around enough, you'll lose out on something very interesting that would have been otherwise helpful. This is something that a lot of Final Fantasy games have a problem with, so you almost need a guide to go through it if you're going to make the most out of your game. The truth is that I should be able to go back and complete side quests or get certain items in previous areas once I start opening up more of the game world, not be shut out of it unless I start an entirely new game. I get that the story can change the world around you, but even then I should at least have some way to go back and get certain things that are there as I pass them. I'm just never a fan of locking people out of stuff that you just don't know about. But my absolute biggest nitpick with Final Fantasy IX is something completely different. Once again, we have a minigame that I'm just not a fan of. Tetramaster is a card game that you could play throughout Gaia. It's very similar to Triple Triad in Final Fantasy VIII, where you collect cards and play against different characters you could challenge within the world. Personally, I just never cared for Triple Triad. It's the same thing here too. What I can't stand is how the game forces you at a certain point of the story to engage with it. Everything comes to a screeching halt and forces you to enter into a tournament for the minigame, otherwise you can't progress the story. Thankfully, you don't have to win a lot of matches to pass it, but if you want certain items and other powerful equipment later on, you're going to have to deal with this, and you're going to have to play this minigame a lot. I just wish that Square wasn't so overzealous with things like this. It would have been better for me if they would have kept Tetramaster within its own bubble within the game's world, and not pushed me into playing it just to progress the story. I just don't want to be taken away from the main story and the combat if I don't want to. It would have been much better if Tetramaster was just easier to understand and play overall, rather than tedious and cheap in certain matches, but alas, it is what it is. Something I should mention is that there's an extra bonus epilogue to the ending of Final Fantasy IX if you happen to hold on to one specific item by the time you reach and finish up the final battle. And while that's kind of cool to have a little bonus stuff towards the end, I actually don't like the way it's handled. To me, I would rather finish up a couple specific tasks to know that I actually did something or that there was something available for me to do to add on a little bit of extra stuff towards the end, as opposed to this one item which, by the way, apparently you could lose it forever and you'll be totally out of luck by the time you reach the ending if you happen to use it for synthesis or do other stuff with it. To me, I just don't like that. I think that's really mishandled. I would rather, again, have a specific side quest or a task, or maybe give me the ability to get that item again in a different way, as opposed to just having one in the game. Again, that's just me being a little bit nitpicky. Maybe you guys feel a little bit differently, but with stuff like that, I just don't think it's really good to lock out the player from certain elements of the game or certain content just because they probably bypassed something or they just didn't know about something and they just happened to walk by it or just never engaged with it. I'm glad to have finally played this, but now we come to the very big question. Can I recommend that you play through Final Fantasy IX on any platform? I honestly feel that certain elements of this game were overhyped to me by others who swear by it. But after taking everything into account, this is the best of the PlayStation Final Fantasy trilogy when it comes to gameplay. For that alone, I think this is a great entry point for those who want to play through the PS1 Final Fantasy games. People weren't lying when they said that this was the game that went back to the basics for the franchise, and it definitely shows. For me, the story has some great parts to it, even though I'm not a big fan of the midway point or certain aspects to the ending. A few characters in your party stick out to me, with Vivi being the favorite because of his backstory and what happens to him by the end. In truth, Final Fantasy IX holds up very well as a PlayStation classic. I could definitely see why so many people have it placed high up on their top-rated games for the series. If you've never played Final Fantasy IX before, you could pick it up now on multiple platforms, including the Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and the PC. You may enjoy your time hanging out with Zidane and the rest of the Final Fantasy IX crew. And there you go, everybody. Those are my thoughts about Final Fantasy IX. Finally, I got to this game after hearing so many people talk about it over the years. It's just, I've dabbled with it in the past, but I never really sat down to fully play it through and do a review kind of like this. And I totally get where people are coming from with it being one of their favorites in the entire series. Again, I think Vivi is the best part of it, but that's just me. And there's a lot of interesting things about it, you know, coming off of Final Fantasy VII and especially Final Fantasy VIII, seeing where Square Enix or Squaresoft's head was back in the day. So a lot of their decisions, I think, made a lot of sense. And it ended up making it into a very interesting and a very good game that everybody should experience at some point or another. But of course, like any other game that I review on this channel, that's just my opinion about Final Fantasy IX. Let me know your own thoughts about this game down below in the comments section. Tell me, are you a big fan of FF9? Are you a big fan of Final Fantasy? What are some of your favorite characters? Do you like Kuja? Do you hate Kuja? I still think he's kind of like mediocre or whack. Just overall, he's just kind of meh in some ways. But tell me some of your other favorite aspects about this series. What do you want to see for like future FF games? Do you guys even want to see a remake of Final Fantasy IX? Now that we have FF7 remake, do you think that maybe some of these other PlayStation games from the series can get a remake or at least get the remake treatment? Talk to me about that stuff down below in the comments section. Thanks a bunch for watching the video. I really appreciate it a ton. I'll have more videos for you to enjoy here on the side that I know you'll love. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon too. Don't forget to visit my Patreon linked below for early access to new videos every week, and join the Discord server too. It's linked in the description box below. You'll definitely love being a part of it. Thanks again, peace out, and stay epic everybody.